In 1926, one of America's wealthiest inventors began shipping entire rooms from medieval European buildings across the Atlantic Ocean. Stone by stone, wall by wall, complete Gothic arches weighing thousands of pounds each. The destination? A cliff overlooking the Massachusetts coastline where absolutely nothing existed except rocks and seawater. John Hayes Hammond Jr. wasn't building a mansion. He was constructing a fortress against reality itself. By the time Hammond Castle was finished in 1929, it had consumed over $6 million. That's $105 million in today's money. But here's what makes this different from every other Gilded Age estate you've heard about. This wasn't built for society. It wasn't built to impress guests or host elaborate parties. It was built to keep everyone out. Hammond was worth approximately $85 million by 1925, equivalent to roughly $1.4 billion today. He held over 800 patents, second only to Thomas Edison. He pioneered radio control technology that would eventually guide missiles and drones. The U.S. military paid him millions for his inventions, yet instead of building a modern palace that celebrated his genius, he created a medieval maze designed to confuse intruders and trap visitors in dead-end hallways. And here's what no one's talking about. The castle wasn't just physically isolated. It became a symbol of Hammond's complete withdrawal from the world that made him rich. While other Gilded Age families were trying desperately to break into New York society, Hammond was literally building walls to keep society away. The structure itself reveals something darker about wealth and obsession that historians consistently ignore. If you're ready to see what really happened when America's second greatest inventor chose isolation over legacy, let's begin. John Hayes Hammond Jr. was born in 1888 into a family that already understood wealth and power. His father, John Hayes Hammond Sr., was one of the world's leading mining engineers. Sr. made his fortune consulting for gold and diamond operations across 3 continents. By the time Jr. was 10 years old, his father was earning the modern equivalent of $15 million per year. But young Hammond didn't want to dig in the dirt. He wanted to control things from a distance. At age 14, he built his first radio-controlled device in his parents' basement. Not a toy. An actual functioning remote control system years before most engineers understood the basic principles. By 16, he was corresponding with Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. By 21, he had filed his first patent for wireless guidance systems. Here's the scale we're talking about. Between 1910 and 1916, Hammond filed 437 patents. That's more than 2 patents every single week for 6 straight years. His inventions covered radio frequency controls, torpedo guidance, early radar concepts, and secure military communications. The U.S. Navy became his biggest customer, paying him millions throughout World War I. By 1920, Hammond's personal wealth reached approximately $45 million. In today's money, that's $675 million. He was 32 years old. Most Gilded Age fortunes took generations to build. Hammond did it in a single decade by being smarter than everyone else in the room. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Hammond had no interest in what typically came with Gilded Age wealth. He didn't care about New York society, didn't care about being invited to Mrs. Astor's ballroom, didn't care about summer cottages in Newport where families competed over which marble came from which Italian quarry. Hammond thought all of it was performative nonsense designed for people with inherited money and no actual talent. And here's the part no one's talking about. Hammond's disdain for Gilded Age society wasn't philosophical rebellion, it was personal rejection. Despite his wealth and his genius, the old money families never fully accepted him. His father made money in mining, which the established elite considered dirty work. New money. Wrong kind of fortune. Hammond attended Yale and joined the right clubs, but he could feel the invisible wall between him and families whose wealth predated the Civil War. So he decided to build his own wall. A real one, made of stone, 70 feet high in some places, and he'd fill it with pieces of European history that predated every American fortune by 500 years. In 1924, Hammond married Irene Fenton, a concert pianist from a respectable Boston family. They honeymooned in Europe, touring castles, cathedrals, and medieval estates across England, France, and Italy. This was standard practice for wealthy Americans, the grand tour. See the old world architecture, buy some art, come home. But Hammond didn't just tour these buildings, he started buying them, piece by piece. In a single 6-month period during 1925, Hammond purchased components from 15 different European structures, an entire dining hall ceiling from a French chateau, stone archways from a Scottish castle, a Gothic fireplace from a monastery in Spain, windows, doors, staircases, and wall sections from buildings that had stood for centuries. He hired teams to carefully dismantle these pieces, catalog every stone, and ship them to Massachusetts. The cost? Approximately $400,000 just for acquisition and shipping. That's $7 million in today's money. And that was before construction even started. Hammond bought a remote piece of coastline in Gloucester, Massachusetts, about 40 miles north of Boston. The property sat on Hesperus Avenue, named after a ship that wrecked on those exact rocks decades earlier. The location was deliberately isolated. No neighboring estates, no easy access from main roads, just cliffs, ocean, and the constant sound of waves crashing against stone. Construction began in 1926 with a team of over 150 workers. But here's where Hammond's obsession revealed itself. He didn't hire a traditional architect. He designed the castle himself, using his engineering background to create something that defied conventional building logic. Rooms weren't symmetrical. Hallways didn't follow straight lines. Staircases were built at odd angles, some leading to dead ends or doorways that opened onto walls. Wait a minute. Why would someone deliberately make their own home confusing and disorienting? Hammond told visitors it was for security. The layout would confuse intruders who didn't know the castle's secrets, but that explanation doesn't hold up. This wasn't a fortress defending against armies. This was a private residence in 1920s Massachusetts. The real reason wasn't security. It was control. Hammond was creating a physical environment where he alone understood the rules, where guests would feel perpetually off balance and dependent on him for guidance. The castle took 3 years to build. During that time, Hammond was on site almost every single day, personally directing where each European stone should be placed. He fired architects who questioned his designs. He rejected contractor suggestions that would have made the structure more livable. He insisted that certain rooms remain dark, that specific hallways stay narrow, that particular doorways be placed in locations that made no architectural sense. By 1929, Hammond Castle was complete, 8,000 square feet of interior space, 60 rooms, an 8,500 pipe organ in the Great Hall, a swimming pool that looked like a Roman bath, a courtyard that replicated a medieval cloister, and everywhere, pieces of authentic European buildings from the 1300s through the 1600s, reassembled in configurations that never existed in their original contexts. The final construction cost reached $6.2 million. That's $105 million today. For context, the average Gilded Age mansion cost between $2 to $3 million to build. Hammond spent double that, and his castle wasn't even in a fashionable location. No society guests would casually drop by. No important families lived nearby. The castle sat alone on its cliff, exactly as Hammond wanted. But worse was coming. Let me show you exactly what Hammond created, because the details reveal everything about his deteriorating psychology. The Great Hall was the castle's centerpiece, 60 feet long, 40 feet wide, with a 40-foot vaulted ceiling taken from a French monastery. Hammond installed his massive pipe organ along one wall, and he played it himself, often at 3 or 4 in the morning. Neighbors reported hearing organ music echoing across the water in the middle of the night. The acoustics were designed to amplify sound throughout the entire castle, meaning anyone inside couldn't escape the music, no matter where they went. The dining room featured a fireplace so large you could stand inside it. The stones came from a 15th century Scottish castle, but Hammond placed the dining table at an angle that prevented more than 6 people from sitting comfortably. For a man worth over $85 million, this was bizarre. Gilded Age mansions were designed for entertaining dozens, sometimes hundreds of guests. Hammond's dining room actively discouraged large gatherings. Then there was the pool room. Hammond built an indoor swimming pool designed to look like a Mediterranean courtyard. He installed a retractable ceiling that could open to the sky. Around the pool, he placed authentic Roman columns and Renaissance statuary. The water was heated year-round, maintained at exactly 78 degrees. But here's the kicker. The pool was only accessible through a single narrow doorway hidden behind a bookcase in the library. Guests couldn't find it unless Hammond personally showed them the secret entrance. The bedroom Hammond shared with his wife Irene sat in the castle's highest tower. To reach it, you had to climb a spiral staircase with 47 steps. The stairs were deliberately uneven, each one a slightly different height, taken from different European buildings. Guests trying to visit the Hammonds' private quarters would stumble on nearly every step. Again, this wasn't security. This was Hammond creating physical barriers that reminded everyone, including his wife, that he controlled access to every part of his domain. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Hammond filled his castle with objects that had nothing to do with each other. A Roman sarcophagus in one room, medieval tapestries in another, Renaissance paintings next to Gothic archways, Egyptian artifacts beside French furniture. Nothing matched, nothing belonged together. The castle wasn't a coherent collection, it was chaos masquerading as culture. Art historians who visited described the interior as deeply unsettling. One wrote that walking through Hammond Castle felt like moving through a rich man's fever dream where centuries collided without reason. The objects were authentic and valuable, but their arrangement suggested someone who collected not out of appreciation, but out of compulsion. Hammond wasn't building a museum. He was hoarding symbols of European antiquity to prove something to himself. And here's the part no one's talking about. Every single room in Hammond Castle was designed to be photographed and viewed, but not actually lived in. The furniture was often too ornate to sit on comfortably. The lighting was too dim for reading. The temperature was too cold for extended stays. Guests reported that the castle felt more like a monument than a home, as if they were walking through a mausoleum built before anyone had died. Hammond's wife, Irene, started spending less and less time at the castle. By 1931, just 2 years after its completion, she was living in their Boston townhouse for weeks at a time. When society reporters asked why, she gave vague answers about preferring the city. But servants reported that Irene found the castle oppressive and isolating. She told friends that living there felt like being imprisoned in someone else's obsession. Now, let's look at what happened to Hammond's social life after the castle was completed. Between 1929 and 1935, Hammond Castle hosted exactly 23 documented social events. That's fewer than 4 per year. For comparison, the Vanderbilt's Marble House in Newport hosted more than 40 events per summer season alone. The Frick Mansion in New York held weekly salons. These were homes designed for society, and they functioned as intended. Hammond's Castle did the opposite. It pushed people away. Guests who did visit reported strange experiences. Several mentioned that Hammond would disappear for hours during their stay, leaving them to wander the confusing hallways alone. Others said he would play his pipe organ late into the night, making sleep impossible. One visitor wrote that Hammond seemed to be testing how long people could tolerate discomfort before making excuses to leave. The few dinner parties Hammond hosted followed no recognizable social protocol. He served food at irregular times, started conversations, and then walked away mid-sentence, gave tours that focused obsessively on minor architectural details while ignoring his guests' obvious discomfort. Society columns in Boston newspapers stopped mentioning Hammond almost entirely by 1933. He had effectively removed himself from the social register, not through scandal, but through sheer weirdness. But here's what's really interesting. Hammond's professional life continued to thrive, even as his personal life collapsed. Between 1930 and 1935, he filed another 214 patents. His radio control systems became industry standard. The military kept him on retainer for $250,000 per year, equivalent to $5.3 million today. Hammond was still brilliant, still productive, still wealthy. The isolation wasn't destroying his career, it was destroying his humanity. Servants who worked at the castle during the 1930s left behind accounts that paint a disturbing picture. Hammond would spend entire days in his workshop beneath the castle, emerging only to eat or play his organ. He stopped bathing regularly, wore the same clothes for weeks, spoke to himself in hallways. One housekeeper reported finding Hammond asleep in different rooms almost every night, as if he couldn't decide where he belonged in his own home. His marriage to Irene effectively ended around 1934, though they never formally divorced. She moved permanently to Boston. Hammond didn't contest it, didn't try to convince her to return. He simply continued living alone in his castle, surrounded by stolen pieces of European history, growing more isolated with each passing year. And then came the financial reality that Hammond's obsession had hidden from view. Maintaining Hammond Castle cost approximately $125,000 per year. That's $2.7 million in today's money, every year, just to keep the building heated, staffed, and maintained. The pipe organ alone required 3 full-time technicians. The European artifacts needed climate control and conservation. The stone walls required constant treatment to prevent erosion from the salt air. Hammond's patent income was substantial, but it wasn't infinite. By 1935, he was spending roughly 18% of his annual income just maintaining a house he barely used. His liquid assets started declining, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but consistently, year after year. The castle consumed his wealth the way it consumed his social life and his marriage. Here's the real reason this matters. Hammond could have sold the castle, could have donated it, could have converted it into a museum or educational institution and taken a tax deduction. But he refused. The castle had become more than property. It was the physical embodiment of his rejection of society, and selling it would mean admitting that his entire obsession had been a mistake. So he kept it, alone, isolated, watching his fortune slowly drain into maintaining a monument to his own alienation. 2/3 of the way through this story, we need to address something that every mainstream documentary and historical account deliberately ignores. Hammond Castle wasn't just an eccentric architectural project. It was a symptom of a larger problem that affected multiple Gilded Age fortunes, and that same problem is destroying wealth today. But nobody's talking about it because it contradicts the myths we tell about success and legacy. Let me show you the reasons why this story stays hidden. Reason 1. Museums and historical societies now own Hammond Castle, and they profit from romanticizing Hammond's obsession. After Hammond died in 1965, the castle was sold to the city of Gloucester and converted into a museum. The official narrative presents Hammond as a quirky genius who built a charming castle filled with European treasures. They host weddings there now, charge admission, sell merchandise. The last thing they want is for visitors to understand that Hammond Castle represents psychological deterioration disguised as cultural preservation. Romance sells tickets. Mental decline doesn't. Reason 2. The technology industry protects Hammond's reputation because he pioneered systems they still profit from today. Radio frequency technology, remote guidance systems, secure communications. Hammond's patents became foundational to modern defense contractors and tech companies. If the broader public understood that the same mind that created these brilliant innovations also created a physically manifested delusion, it might raise uncomfortable questions about genius and instability. Silicon Valley prefers its eccentric billionaires to seem visionary, not mentally troubled. Reason 3. Wealth management professionals don't want clients thinking about how rich people actually destroy their own fortunes. Hammond's story reveals that you don't need gambling or fraud to waste generational wealth. You just need obsession and unlimited resources. Financial advisors make money by managing assets and encouraging investment. They don't make money by pointing out that their clients' pet projects might be manifestations of psychological problems. Hammond spent the modern equivalent of $105 million building something that provided zero financial return and actively damaged his quality of life. That's not a cautionary tale the wealth management industry wants circulating. Reason 4. The narrative of American exceptionalism can't accommodate the idea that our second most prolific inventor was also profoundly lonely and possibly mentally ill. We want our geniuses to be triumphant. Thomas Edison as the hardworking inventor who lit up America. Hammond should fit that mold, the brilliant engineer who made America safer through his defense innovations. But Hammond's actual life contradicts that story. He achieved extraordinary professional success and used it to build a prison. That's not the kind of American success story we put in textbooks. Reason 5. Academic historians avoid psychological analysis of historical figures because it's considered speculative and unscholarly. You can write detailed analyses of Hammond's patents, his business dealings, his correspondence, but suggest that his castle represents untreated mental illness or personality disorder, and you'll be accused of armchair psychology. Never mind that the physical evidence, the deliberately confusing architecture, the obsessive collecting, the social withdrawal, the deteriorating self-care, all points to something beyond mere eccentricity. Academic history prefers documentation over interpretation, even when the interpretation is obvious. Reason 6. Hammond's family and descendants have worked to maintain a sanitized version of his legacy. Hammond's relatives donated his papers to Yale and other institutions with the understanding that certain personal materials would remain sealed. Letters suggesting marital problems, financial concerns, or psychological struggles aren't easily accessible to researchers. The public image of Hammond as brilliant inventor and cultured collector is carefully curated. Any suggestion that he was deeply troubled gets pushback from family foundations that control access to primary sources. Reason 7. The broader culture needs to believe that wealth and success lead to happiness and fulfillment. Hammond's story destroys that myth completely. Here was a man with everything: money, genius, recognition, access to any experience or object he desired. And he used all of it to build walls. Literal stone walls between himself and other human beings. If we acknowledge what that means, we have to confront uncomfortable truths about what wealth actually provides versus what we think it provides. It's easier to just call Hammond eccentric and move on. Now, let's see what happened as Hammond aged alone in his isolated fortress. By 1940, Hammond was 52 years old. He continued working on patents and military contracts, but his output had declined. Between 1940 and 1950, he filed only 73 patents compared to hundreds in previous decades. His income remained substantial, approximately $300,000 per year from royalties and consulting, equivalent to $6.4 million today. But his expenses continued eating into his principal wealth. World War II brought renewed interest in Hammond's remote control and communication systems. The military expanded his contracts, and for a brief period, Hammond emerged from isolation to work directly with defense engineers. Colleagues from that era reported that he seemed more engaged and social when focused on technical problems. But the moment contracts were fulfilled, Hammond retreated back to his castle. The post-war years revealed the full extent of Hammond's disconnect from modern reality. While America embraced suburban development, consumer culture, and technological optimism, Hammond continued obsessing over medieval artifacts. He spent the late 1940s acquiring more European antiquities, many of questionable provenance, filling rooms that were already overstuffed with contradictory objects. His few remaining friends noticed the deterioration. Hammond's conversation became increasingly circular, returning obsessively to the same topics: the superiority of European craftsmanship, the vulgarity of modern architecture, the stupidity of people who didn't appreciate authentic historical artifacts. He would interrupt himself mid-sentence to play his organ, then resume talking hours later as if no time had passed. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Hammond had built his entire identity around being different from other Gilded Age families, and by the 1950s, those families had either adapted or disappeared. The Vanderbilts had sold most of their mansions. The Astors had converted estates into museums. Even families that maintained wealth had shifted toward modern investment strategies and corporate structures. Hammond's rejection of society no longer felt like defiance. It just felt like being left behind. Here's what happened to the money. By 1955, Hammond's net worth had declined to approximately $30 million in period dollars, equivalent to $340 million today. Still wealthy by any measure, but representing a 65% reduction from his peak wealth 30 years earlier. The castle's maintenance continued, consuming roughly $200,000 per year. Hammond refused to reduce staff or close sections of the building. He seemed to believe that maintaining the physical structure would somehow validate the decades he'd spent building and filling it. His health declined through the late 1950s. Heart problems, circulation issues, difficulty navigating the castle stairs that he'd deliberately made uneven. Hammond hired live-in nurses but refused to modify the building for accessibility. He continued sleeping in different rooms, continued playing his organ at odd hours, continued the behaviors that had defined his isolation. On February 12, 1965, John Hayes Hammond Jr. died of heart failure in his castle. He was 76 years old. Despite his wealth and his patents and his possessions, Hammond died essentially alone. Irene had passed away in 1959. They'd been separated for over 25 years. Hammond had no children. His funeral was attended by fewer than 30 people, mostly distant relatives and former business associates. His will revealed the final tragedy. Hammond left his entire estate, including the castle and all its contents, to be sold. He provided no specific instructions for preservation, no vision for how his obsession should be maintained. After spending 40 years collecting and arranging objects he claimed were invaluable cultural artifacts, Hammond treated them like any other asset to be liquidated. The castle and its contents were initially valued at $4.2 million, equivalent to $41 million today. But finding a buyer proved nearly impossible. Who wants a deliberately confusing castle filled with architectural fragments that don't belong together? What family could afford the $200,000 annual maintenance cost? After 3 years on the market with zero offers, Hammond's estate sold the property to the city of Gloucester for just $30,000, less than 1% of its supposed value. Gone, disappeared, over. Everything Hammond built, everything he collected, everything he arranged according to his private obsessions, reduced to a minor transaction in a municipal budget. The city converted it into a museum, not because they particularly valued Hammond's vision, but because they needed a tourist attraction. Today, Hammond Castle generates approximately $300,000 in annual revenue from admissions, events, and rentals. It's a wedding venue. People take prom photos there. None of them know who John Hayes Hammond Jr. was or why he built it. This is happening today, too. Different locations, different time period, same fundamental mistake. Howard Hughes spent his final years isolated in hotel penthouses, refusing to see anyone, deteriorating mentally while maintaining obsessive control over his environment. Hughes was worth approximately $1.5 billion when he died in 1976. Like Hammond, he was a brilliant engineer who pioneered aviation technology. Like Hammond, he used his wealth to build walls between himself and other people. The parallels are exact. Nicolas Cage spent over $150 million on castles, rare artifacts, and unusual properties during the 2000s. 2 actual European castles, dinosaur skulls, shrunken heads, comic books worth millions. Cage wasn't building a single obsessive structure like Hammond, but he was doing the same thing, using wealth to accumulate objects as substitutes for meaningful connection. Cage ended up $14 million in debt and had to sell everything. The compulsion to collect, to own, to control through possession, identical pattern. Mike Tyson earned over $400 million during his boxing career and declared bankruptcy in 2003. Beyond the obvious spending on cars and jewelry, Tyson spent millions on exotic animals, including Bengal tigers he kept at his properties. Like Hammond's deliberate architectural confusion, Tyson's tigers served no practical purpose. They were expensive, dangerous barriers between himself and normal life, symbols of power that actually represented profound isolation. And look at modern tech billionaires building massive compounds in Hawaii, New Zealand, and Montana. These aren't just vacation homes, they're modern versions of Hammond Castle, isolated properties designed to be self-sufficient, protected from the outside world, filled with expensive objects and systems that serve no purpose except to demonstrate wealth and control. The technology is different. The fundamental psychology is identical. Here's the pattern. Extraordinary talent creates extraordinary wealth. Extraordinary wealth enables obsessive behavior without consequence. Obsessive behavior gets mistaken for eccentricity or vision. The person becomes increasingly isolated. The isolation reinforces the obsession. The wealth drains into maintaining the physical manifestation of the obsession. And eventually, the person dies alone, surrounded by expensive objects that meant nothing to anyone else. Hammond's story from 1926 is playing out in 2025 with different details but identical outcomes. Let me be direct about what Hammond Castle actually represents. This wasn't about architecture or collecting or even isolation. This was about a brilliant man who couldn't distinguish between building a life and building a structure. Hammond confused accumulation with achievement. He thought that by owning pieces of European history, he could somehow own historical significance. He thought that by creating a physically imposing building, he could impose meaning on his existence. He was wrong. The castle reveals that wealth without purpose becomes obsession. Hammond had no heirs to build for, no political ambitions that required a power base, no charitable vision that needed institutional permanence. He just had money and brilliance and a deep-seated belief that society had rejected him. So he rejected society back, using stone and mortar to make that rejection permanent. But here's the kicker. Hammond's professional achievements actually mattered. His radio control patents influenced military technology for decades. His communication systems advanced the field of electrical engineering. His work had measurable impact on human capability. Yet, Hammond himself didn't value these achievements enough to simply continue working and living normally. Instead, he channeled his energy into building something that served no purpose except to house his rejection of the world. Display destroys wealth. Savings build it, but Hammond's story adds another level. Obsession disguised as legacy destroys everything: wealth, relationships, mental health, and ultimately, the very reputation it's supposed to protect. The numbers tell the final story. Hammond spent $6.2 million building the castle, $105 million today. He spent approximately $125,000 per year maintaining it for 36 years. That's $4.5 million in total maintenance, equivalent to $77 million today. Combined construction and maintenance, $10.7 million in period dollars, $182 million today. And what did that investment produce? A building worth $30,000 at sale, a return of 0.28% on his investment. He would have done literally thousands of times better just leaving the money in a basic savings account. But Hammond didn't build the castle for financial return. He built it as a monument to isolation, and in that specific goal, he succeeded perfectly. The castle stands today, still isolated on its cliff, still confusing to visitors, still filled with objects that don't belong together. It worked exactly as intended. Hammond successfully built a physical structure that keeps the world at arm's length even 70 years after his death. The tragedy isn't that he failed. The tragedy is that he succeeded. Hammond Castle wasn't a triumph of engineering or cultural preservation. It was wealth converted directly into loneliness, brilliance transformed into compulsion, and legacy reduced to a warning. John Hayes Hammond Jr. held over 800 patents. He pioneered technology that still protects military communications today. He could have been remembered as one of America's greatest inventors, standing alongside Edison and Tesla in the historical record. Instead, he's remembered as the weird rich guy who built a fake castle and died alone. The total financial damage, $182 million in today's money, spent building and maintaining a structure that provided zero return. A 65% reduction in net worth from peak to death, an estate that couldn't find a buyer at any reasonable price, and a legacy reduced to a municipal tourist attraction that generates enough revenue to keep the lights on. But the human damage was worse. A marriage destroyed, Decades of isolation, a brilliant mind trapped in an obsession that produced nothing of value, a life that could have continued contributing to human knowledge instead, wasted arranging stones from dead buildings in configurations that pleased no one. And nobody's talking about this because acknowledging Hammond's failure means confronting uncomfortable truths about wealth and success. It means admitting that money doesn't solve psychological problems, it funds them. It means recognizing that genius and mental illness can coexist. It means accepting that our cultural mythology about Gilded Age grandeur is often covering up profound dysfunction. Hammond Castle stands today as America's most isolated Gilded Age structure. Not physically, there are plenty of remote estates, isolated in meaning, isolated in purpose, isolated in legacy. A monument built to keep the world out that successfully kept meaning from ever getting in. The castle outlived its creator, just as Hammond planned. But immortality without purpose is just stone and mortar slowly eroding on a cliff. That's all Hammond Castle ever was. That's all it will ever be, and that's why nobody wants to talk about what it really means. Next time, we'll examine the Woolworth Mansion, another Gilded Age fortune, another tragic ending, another story they don't want you to know. But for now, look at Hammond Castle and understand what it's really showing you. Not wealth, not genius, not legacy, just obsession that outlasted the man who built it, standing as a warning that everyone prefers to ignore.